believe we are broadcasting live. I want to welcome you all and thank you for joining us today. My name is Sinead Finnerty-Pyne and I head up the Public Outreach and Communications for Lorcan O'Herlihy Architects, LOHA. It's a pleasure to be here today to bring together this panel of talented individuals with a broad range of expertise in design, urban design and development. This panel is the second of two conversations that we're organizing on the future of the public realm from a Detroit point of view. And yesterday we heard from a panel of community engagement professionals and activists who shared their perspectives and experiences on how their work shifted and evolved as a result of COVID, and how they are giving a platform to those who are not always heard, and those are the most impacted by the current pandemic. If you didn't have a chance to listen, both panels will be available on the Detroit Design Corps website and will be rebroadcasted by Azure Magazine, so we can share the links when they become available. It will also be available on LOHA's website. Just to give you a little bit of background about our firm, LOHA is a collective of 25 architects and urban designers based in Los Angeles and Detroit, and we design from the conviction that architect is a social act, that it can be a catalyst for change. In other words, it's not just about designing a building as an isolated object, but how we can engage the world and all the forces that are shaping our world. So this is part and parcel why we are organizing this series of discussions, so we can initiate a public dialogue to our colleagues and with our colleagues in the field, and share ideas about how we can work together to shape cities so that they're more livable and more equitable. As Lorcan will share with you shortly, a critical part of our work is to blur the public-private realm and provide outdoor spaces and social spaces within our buildings. And now these kinds of spaces are more important than ever with the current pandemic. And that, coupled with the fact that our new social spaces is this virtual realm that we're in now, we will obviously need to reconnect at some point back to each other. And so what we can do now to look towards the future is really important. So on that note, I also wanted to mention that we have a book that will be coming out, if you can do next slide, will be coming out this fall, called Architecture as a Social Act. And it really explores this topic further, looking at 25 years of our work, and it features 28 projects and really underscores the direct connection between consciously designed buildings and a wider effort to tackle issues that are relevant to a rapidly changing world. So it will be on Amazon coming up here in the coming months in November, and it has a number of projects from both Los Angeles and Detroit. Next slide. So the overall topic that we'll be discussing today is how the pandemic can be reframed as an opportunity to reconsider how we can navigate our cities differently and more productively, so that they can be better adapted to fit the needs of all. And I'm really happy to bring together a really great panel for you today to discuss these ideas. All three of these individuals have worked together over the years, specifically on the Brush Park City Modern project, which we'll be discussing in this presentation. So we have Lorcan O'Herlihy, founder and design principal of LOHA, Melissa Dittmer, Chief Creative Officer at Bedrock Detroit, and Stephen Lewis, principal of ZGF, formerly the Director of Planning and Development for the City of Detroit's Central Region. I just want to give a quick announcement about Stephen. He has been unfortunately called away to an emergency meeting, but he will be joining us at the half-hour mark to do a presentation, and then we'll need to once again leave, but has brought to us today a wonderful individual named John Savills from the City of Detroit, lead urban designer for the central planning region of the City of Detroit, who will be joining us for the breakout conversation. So I just really want to thank you, John, for being here and for stepping in to speak to us about these important issues. Let's see. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and hand over the mic to Lorcan to discuss some of our work. Thank you, Lorcan.
Thank you, Sinead. It's a pleasure to be on this panel discussion with all of you. I'm going to start by saying I've always been fascinated with urban life, in particular public space, through my career and my fascination with cities has existed for many, many years. So I also say that we're living in a time where, although we have become more connected than ever through social media and other technologies, which in a sense is a new public space, we are paradoxically more and more isolated by those very tools. At this very moment in time, however, with the current pandemic, these tools are what is keeping us connected and thriving as best we can. However, I believe that they cannot replace what we can achieve through physical human contact. We are, in a sense, social beasts, human beings. And it has proven to have a lasting impact on health and well-being to be engaging others. That said, it's more critical than ever to design spaces that bring us together. It's important to design these as dynamic networks. Next slide. From top-down solutions to generative bottom-up strategies, both of which achieve greater connectivity and diversity. Here you're looking at two bottom-up strategies that are truly about taking back the public domain in a guerrilla way. On the left is a project by a collective of artists in the 70s in Los Angeles called ASCO, whose work was influenced by public policies and planning that was creating economic and geographic disparity in East Los Angeles. In this image, you can see how they are, in a sense, reclaiming the city. On the right, you can see a more common sense group of skateboarders who were quite literally carving away this public space and reactivating it in an inventive way. Next slide. Movements such as these, that in many ways can be considered a form of social activism, have ironically inspired many contemporary planned public spaces, such as skate parks and parklets. Likewise, I'm also interested by some of the more top-down institutional cultural strategies. When done well, spaces that are designed by artists that often blur the public-private divide. Here on the left is Chris Burden's Urban Light, which in a sense today is the most prominent public space in Los Angeles. And this is at the LA County Museum of Art, which is going through a tremendous transformation right now. And wonderful space. And on the right, you'll see Jessica Stockholder's Color Jam, and that's located in Chicago, where the artist quite literally created a 3D painting at a major city intersection. This engagement of arts engagements of space. In our work, we likewise bring aspects of public realm into our projects. This idea of borrowing space from the private domain is challenging, but we are committed to this principle, whether they be through small or large gestures. We believe that this brings value to the projects and benefits how people live. In addition to all of our projects all our projects have embraced openness and porosity and have embraced passive design strategies such as cross-ventilation, exterior access to units, where possible, open outdoor spaces, among other things. These are all simple moves that improve the quality of life, health, and well-being for people living in our projects. We are a practice that has been based for almost 30 years in Los Angeles and 5 years in Detroit, where we have had many meaningful collaborations that have inspired us. Both cities are wholly unique and present different challenges, yet both offer great opportunities in terms of how we can evolve urban culture. Something that I'd like to reiterate today is I do not believe that density is the main culprit for spreading COVID. I believe there are other critical reasons that is leading to the spread. It's about taking the precautions necessary so that people can live safely among one another. And a great part of this is giving people spaces to do so safely and equitably so that cities can continue to thrive. Instead of seeing how cities might recover from COVID, we should be looking at what opportunities exist in cities and how we can shift the conversation in what cities can be. Both COVID and the Black Lives Matter movement have both shown us the deep inequalities. These inequities have driven us to work in neighborhoods that have been socioeconomically marginalized and to bring the same kind of outdoor spaces to these neighborhoods through public and private partnerships. So we're looking to engage cities and bring communities and create enriching neighborhoods. Part of the solution is to provide ample outdoor space to all parts of the city. How can we rethink our current transportation other than cars? What if we give back a portion of our streets to pedestrians and not just cars? This is our East Lane intersection project in Los Angeles that takes a small wedge-shaped parcel next to a major freeway intersection and brings 54 units of affordable housing, as well as a slow street and living lawn funded by the Annenberg Foundation. This will help to filter particulates from the nearby pollution of the freeways. This is what architecture is. It's about having these critical moves and gestures. Likewise, we have applied these strategies to our urban planning projects in Detroit. This is an image from the Russell Woods Norton Park Neighborhood Study Project, where we sought to highlight their opportunities and protect their character for future development. Within the rich urban tapestry of both neighborhoods, the study presented unlimited potential for growth and social, cultural, and economic advancement. You can see how we expanded the sidewalks, dual bike lanes that connect with pop-up retail spaces that bring a range of scales and types of public program opportunities to the neighborhood. And this allows business owners to test the market. Here you can see a similar strategy that reduces the amount of space given to cars and promotes more pedestrian and bike activity, critical component that we need in Detroit. I also want to take a moment to say we designed in such a way that speaks to a city's history and context and is always informed by the people that live there. We begin with facts on the ground, working from the bottom up, not the top down. This approach was taken in our Northwest Detroit study, which we planned for 7 square miles. We identified 4 key neighborhoods that had been stewarded by local artists and activists who had been fighting the good fight for many years. One of these was the Old Redford neighborhood, which you can see above. It was not our job to change what they had done, but rather to contribute to it by making small incremental changes like repurposing existing buildings and improving outdoor connections. Above you can see how we built upon the existing artist alley by adding a pop-up arts promenade behind the Old Redford Bowl. It's also in Northwest Detroit, and it's also a Redford neighborhood, which is an area that we are deeply involved with through a number of our studies. So what was critical to this was to how can architecture act as a catalyst for change to promote urban renewal. We restored a former bank in this project that had been abandoned for many years and are now working with the collaborators at the platform, which is the development team, as part of a larger effort to support local community initiatives. This project will include housing, community spaces, gathering spaces, and retail. We had the great pleasure of working with our colleague Oliami Davos on the African Bead Museum on Grand River Avenue. This project builds upon Davos' strategy for bringing community together by creating a gathering space as opposed to the traditional museum to showcase his extensive collection and bring community together. A very exciting project for us. Here you can see some images from last summer that celebrated the launch of a new gathering space we designed for him. So very exciting day, very vibrant to be there during this whole event. With that in mind, and last but not least, we are excited to announce a recently completed John R. 2660 project, which is part of Bedrock's City Modern project at Brush Park. This is our first of 4 buildings that is going to go up there, join a number of other buildings that are already underway. We hope that this project can be a model for revitalizing an urban district and forging a path for neighborhood growth. One of the moves that I'm excited about in this project is that we were able to remove parking from our buildings, which allowed the central part of the project to not be inundated with cars. A critical move on this project. Very exciting to be able to pull some cars off of this space. And reducing the influence on automobile was crucial so that it could be used for pedestrians. Ideally, the central part of this project is a muse. It's activated by people, bikes, great energy about neighborhoods. And that's what's so exciting about this project. So on that note, I will indeed turn the floor over to Melissa Dittmer, who we worked with on this project.
Thanks, Lorcan. Hello, everyone. My name is Melissa Dittmer. I'm the Chief Design Officer at Bedrock. I've been with Bedrock and the family of companies for about 7 years. And so this panel posed a really interesting question for us who are in development and working at a scale of development within the city, and how it influences the public realm and who is the public realm. And in the past year, we've had very interesting, you can go to the next slide. We've had a really interesting, pivotal 6 months in figuring out how to tell stories about the public realm. And so that's how I'm framing up this conversation today. In that in 1990, the New York Times published that article about the tragedy of Detroit. And over the next 2 decades, there were a series of sort of development moves and real estate moves that were done in order to improve the public realm and improve Detroit's narrative, like GM buying, transitioning its home to the Renaissance Center, next slide, to a series of large scale real estate projects like stadiums, next slide, and the construction of multiple casinos, next slide, which gets us to 20 years later, or almost 20 years later. The New York Times did another headline, or the Time magazine did a headline mirroring the tragedy of Detroit with similar pictures of vacancy and blight in the background. So 20 years later, the large scale real estate development was not moving the overall narrative. And I think this is because the 20 years spent was focusing on very specific real estate projects that were very insular, sort of isolated, without working on the public realm specifically. At the end of that decade, 2009, 2010, there was a shift in Detroit, new political leadership. The automotive industry was coming in and out of bankruptcy towards solvency. The city was coming out of bankruptcy and insolvency. And there was a series of public spaces that were being knit together on the riverfront that was starting to create a public realm. And there was also economic diversification happening in the city, sort of moving Detroit away from a one-horse town of the automotive industry. Next slide. Which led to a monumental decision, which was at that 2010, Dan Gilbert, my boss, decided to move his corporation, Quicken Loans, downtown with 1,700 team members to this building, which was formerly the CompuWare building. Now we call it One Campus Martius. The intention, as he moved downtown, was to do good, to do well with his real estate. So you can just go through these next couple of slides quickly. Over the next 10 years, every single blue building is a building that then Quicken Loans and Bedrock as a real estate company purchased. And so you can see over the years, the amount of investment and the amount of scale of the real estate portfolio, I'm going to speak while this slide slowly rolls in, increased dramatically. So what started with 1,700 people in one building, by a decade later, was over 115 properties, including so much parking, it's hard to put a number to, 18,000 team members, and over $5 billion committed to development projects. But when you look at this, you start to realize the scale of real estate and how it's affecting the public realm. Next slide. So here's just a few before and after images of Woodward, and then you go to the next slide, where we have our Shinola Hotel, streetscape improvements, and all of the ground floor real estate and ground floor of the buildings have been filled. Here's our David Stott, which was a vacant and abandoned building, skyscraper, 35 stories, converted to residential with tenants moving in the past year. Next slide. The renovation of multiple office buildings, showing the before on the left and the after on the right. Next slide. And then we come to moving up in scale to neighborhoods like City Modern that Lorcan referenced. So before image of City Modern Brush Park, after image or during construction image from this past winter, showing the projects, the 20 plus buildings in progress in Brush Park right now. Next slide. Public spaces. We've spent a lot of time working on the programming and the activation of public spaces, including what you're seeing here, which is Campus Martius, and making sure to program those spaces to be filled at various times of the year with hundreds of thousands of people. Next slide. And then we've also activated some of our smaller vacant spaces with various design activations and design advocacy exhibitions that are shown in these images here, like a roller skating rink or a ball pit or an exhibition we put on every 2 years called Detroit Design 139. Next slide. And so over the past 10 years, you can see this sort of timeline of narratives about Detroit, going from Motown or ghost town ruin porn in Detroit and shifting over time as the sort of large scale real estate, public realm improvements, and also university and partnerships created towards improving this narrative and working on the public realm, so that we get to the right, we have Detroit, city of the past, city of tomorrow, multiple narratives about the improvements happening. Next slide. So that we have now the Time magazine on the left, Tragedy of Detroit, to the New York Times 2017, almost 30 years later, talking about Detroit, the most exciting city in America, and making the top 10 lists of places to go. Next slide. So that's been a pivotal decade for Bedrock and us in terms of real estate because of the scale of our portfolio. And then if you go through these next couple of slides, we know that we have even more real estate coming on the horizon, from everything from our 1 million square foot Hudson site to Monroe Blocks project to the continuation of City Modern that we're going to speak about a bit more, to Douglas, which is another 20 acres in Brush Park here, which will be future development of over almost 1,000 residential units and public spaces. Next slide. To our Gratiot site, which was the former jail that now we are partnering with the University of Michigan and Related to redevelop what was the jail site into a University of Michigan center, to the potential improvements of the 375 infrastructure that carries down to the riverfront and future development on the riverfront. Next slide. So while the past decade has been impressive enough in its scale, the next decade is going to be grow even more impressively than the first decade. And so I think where we are here in 2020 is a really poignant moment to pause and have a year of clarity. Next slide. So we have, like everyone else, spent the past 6 months working from home, understanding how COVID has affected all of us, and not all of us in equal ways, and also understanding the Black Lives Matter movement and the largest civil rights movement in history, watching all of this happening from our home, and also contemplating what does this mean for our real estate portfolio and the public realm. And so, you know, we started with this sort of this quote here talking about multicultural marketing. So under currently right now as the Chief Design Officer, I have architecture and marketing, design narratives and multimedia. They all roll up through me, and we tell stories about real estate. We tell stories about our city, and we tell stories about our public realm. And about a year ago, we started shifting to telling more multicultural appropriate stories. So if you go to the next slide. And so what does that mean for Detroit? It's not just a case of black and white. It's not just a case of men and women. It's truly understanding what it means to create this public realm and this real estate for all people, for all diversity and inclusion, not just from your primary attributes, but your secondary attributes of income and religious beliefs and marital status, and how do we bring that full spectrum of diversity into our real estate portfolios and our public spaces. So if you go to the next slide. And then with the Black Lives Matter movement, we realized that the ways in which we're designing and programming these spaces to be inclusive needs to be something that just isn't just making people feel comfortable coming to those spaces, but is also creating spaces that eliminate systematic inequality. So we have been spending the past 6 months sort of comprehensively reviewing all of our processes for how we design and program public spaces and real estate. Next slide. And then also how we tell the stories about that. And we've been working with our larger entities within the family of companies to put forward not just design processes that result in more equitable spaces, but also diversity and inclusion action plans to address race, law enforcement, and equity inclusion within those public spaces. Next slide. So we set forward a strategic partnership with our diversity and inclusion team. Next slide. That has resulted in what we now have is a process by which we can use as a case study and a potential model of process to roll out with some of our other teams across the real estate company, but then also across our family of companies. So here's just this sort of step-by-step process by which we've been working over the past 9 months to assess what we've been doing. And then if you go to the next slide. It is not a sort of step-by-step process that results in a linear line. Of course, it is a iterative process that has resulted in many twists and turns, but has ended in us assessing the ways in which we tell our stories, the deliverables in which we're creating that talk about our projects and help those feel included in coming into our spaces. Next slide. And then we've also been working towards improving the professions in which we all are working within. And we know that those professions themselves are systems and frameworks that don't provide equal opportunities for people of all diversity to be included in those professions. And so we've set up action plans in place that includes team member education, design profession, pipeline development. We're readdressing the ways in which we are hiring our consultants and impressing upon our future consultants the importance of diversity and inclusion even within their companies before they get hired. Sponsorships and financial support, and then ultimately volunteerism, mentorship, and outreach. So next slide. So as we go forward in our next decade, we're really taking a moment right now to make sure that as we guide our portfolio forward, we are approaching our portfolio as more of a multicultural design approach, and hoping that as we design and create this portfolio and our public spaces, that we are putting forward places and programs that appeal to everyone who lives, works, and plays in our city. So it took us right up to 4:30. And with that, I think I'm concluded. Sinead, you're on mute.
Unmute myself, sorry. I don't think we have Stephen Lewis on the call just yet, but this might just be a good moment to a little bit more introduce. Thank you, Melissa and Lorcan, by the way. Just really exciting to see, obviously, our work I'm very familiar with, but Melissa, the work that you're doing in Detroit to create these inclusive communities, and how obviously everything has changed in the past 6 months and will continue to evolve, hopefully, so that that idea of inclusion is, ooh, I think we might have Stephen in here. Let's see, or maybe not. Okay. So I just want to take this moment to go ahead and introduce John Savills. John, as I mentioned, is the lead urban designer for the Central Planning Region in the city of Detroit. And he has a diverse portfolio of micro and macro scale projects, including commercial, cultural, institutional, and government within the United States and internationally. At the city, John currently manages the implementation of the Eastern Market Framework and the East Riverfront Framework, He advises and serves on stakeholder committees for neighborhood planning processes, parks, and development projects through the central region. And John manages the community benefits ordinance process for the Henry Ford Detroit Pistons Performance Center, and is a graduate of Virginia Polytechnic Institute with a bachelor's degree in architecture and a master's of science in architecture. So, not to put you on the spot too much, John, before Stephen presents, but maybe you could touch a little bit on, and this might dovetail nicely into when Stephen does come on, to just talk about some of the efforts that the city is currently making to also obviously bolster the sense of inclusiveness, and obviously the neighborhood studies that we participated in Northwest Detroit and Russell Woods Narn Park. You can see how that's already happening, but maybe how things have even sort of fast tracked from where we were 6 months ago.
Thank you, Sinead. Again, my name is John Sevils. I think with the effort, which I'm not going to say it necessarily began with Maurice Cox, but certainly it was greatly enhanced with Maurice Cox's tenure here. We have always tried to look at how we would see Detroiters in places in the city where, say for instance, downtown or somewhere on the riverfront. And a lot of that has to do with there are people in the city of Detroit who hadn't left their respective neighborhoods and didn't think that the riverfront or didn't think that downtown was for them, for instance. So with development, something that we always, just in its nascent form, begin to insist on showing Detroiters in these places of all backgrounds, particularly African American. And just to say that you have a connection to downtown, and we're working connections to downtown, we're working on connections to the riverfront, and they're going to come from your neighborhood into these areas. But alongside of that, within your neighborhoods themselves, what is it, you know, downtown and the riverfront is the big glossy picture, but what is of the neighborhood, the condition of your neighborhood itself, and how do we have that intervention to say that let's improve your livelihood within that? We've talked a lot in the past about, some of you may have heard about 20-minute neighborhoods within the city of Detroit, and that's just to be able to live, to be able to shop, to be able to have connections to things, to needed services, to try to be in an area that you didn't have to experience a tremendous amount of blight, all within a 20-minute radius from where you walk, from where you live, within your neighborhood. With COVID, it has heightened the sensitivity, I think, to how we begin to observe how people move and how we talk about just creating spaces or what spaces suddenly mean. You know, there was a talk that was given earlier this week alongside of or within the Detroit Month of Design, in which I believe it was Craig Wilkins who talked about just having the space to breathe. And what does that mean? Because we never really thought about that before, other than say maybe a personal space if you're talking about something that's more emotional, but just the space to breathe, because it's the human reaction of we're told to stay in, and when we have the opportunity to go out, what is it that we're doing? And usually it's getting in a car and going someplace that's a little bit of a distance. When you don't have that opportunity, what does that begin to suggest as to what your environment is like? And just to see and observe how people move about parks and how people are changing their livelihoods within their own home, their interior environment. So I think, you know, it's just been an interesting process, just my observation. As Sinead noted, I went to school in Virginia. I grew up in Virginia. I've been in Detroit 4 4 years. And the one thing that I have realized about Detroit is that people here have a story that they need to tell, and it hasn't always been heard. And it didn't begin with Black Lives Matter movement. This is something that has long been the case, and it's something that's not unique to Detroit, but just because of what has happened in Detroit, it's in a more concentrated form. So I think with what we tried to do with the city is just to begin to raise the lot of across the city in a more equitable fashion with the means that we do have, with our targeted framework studies to strengthen areas that are on the cusp of going even higher, or without any intervention could go in the opposite direction. But from that to begin to build centers that can begin to radiate out, and to begin to provide those centers of opportunity and inclusion, access, delivery of services, et cetera.
It's a good segue.
Here you are. Great.
I've been giving you space because you're doing a great job. And thank you so much for saving my ass. But, this is a really great segue into what I had planned to and will now present to you all, because it's part of this picture of sort of spatial equity, if you will, and how people read, understand, interpret, have agency or so forth to occupy certain spaces that maybe have historical signals embedded in them that send quite the opposite message. So I want to talk a little about the intersection between Black Lives Matter and the public realm. And I co-authored an article with a colleague from ZGF recently for the Seattle Business Journal about reclaiming streets and converting them from vehicular priority to pedestrian priority. And we split, you know, he offered me the first 500 words, he took the second, and his was very technical. Mine started with the adage, if you build it, they will come. The existential question is, who are they? And if we go to the next slide, I think in Detroit, it is intentionally made very clear between the Downtown Detroit Partnership, working with Bedrock, to improve and create opportunities within the downtown to invite and welcome all Detroiters. Now, yes, there was some physical intervention in terms of closing a portion of a street and painting the patterns of a basketball court, or several basketball courts for that matter, which operate during the times of good climate in the summer, and really welcome anyone who wants to join a pickup game in the middle of the day to participate. The street and its physical conversion, if you will, is not in itself enough to bring these people who we're seeing in this slide to this location to participate in this activity. If you build it, they will come. They will come if the invitation is expressed through programming, through cultural references that may be deployed and have a physical manifestation, or they may be simply occupied, as we've seen through these times, in more of a guerrilla state. Next slide. Now, this is an example from that article of the imagining of a shared public realm where people don't have to be pushed all the way to one intersection in order to cross the street, where they have much more fluidity in their ability. And if we go one more, to show that the opportunities to take buildings that frame that infrastructure and achieve a level of transparency so that the line between inside and out, between interior and public realm, gets blurred a little bit, and to really, and by doing so visually, to be able to more easily extend program and activity between those kinds of spaces. Next. And this is just a oblique aerial view of how that all sort of lays out. It's very interesting. There are certainly vulnerabilities in the idea when you layer on the whole idea of who is this for. Often when, as we experienced in Detroit, even when we went into certain neighborhoods and we were talking about replacing so many flags of sidewalk that had been uprooted by tree roots over the years, there was a resistance by residents fearing that as we made these kinds of improvements, that property values would go up and that they would be displaced. Peeling back the layers of that a little bit, it's more about the rental population. It's more vulnerable. If you're a owner, you will benefit as property values increase, unless you're on a fixed income and property taxes go up faster than your fixed income does, and you're threatened with foreclosure at that point. So Mayor Duggan has done, extraordinary things within the limits of our capitalist society, market-driven world, to provide opportunities so that no Detroiter who wants to remain in the city limits has to leave it. It may mean they may have to relocate from one neighborhood to another through the Bridging Neighborhoods program, but still it's, given the structure of our economic system, it's a pretty bold move and a way to signal that the people that have toughed it out through the bad times to get to this good time are going to benefit and not be left behind. Okay, next. And this is Spirit Plaza out in front of City Hall, and it was originally laid out as a pop-up and a temporary installation to test the appetite of Detroiters who are very car dependent in the Motor City from losing that last leg of access from the Woodward Avenue, the north-south primary route, to the Jefferson, which is the street that borders the river. There are colleagues of mine who are in this industry who I would like to think are like-minded, but who have expressed to me their frustration by not being able to drive all the way to that intersection and make a left turn or a right turn. And I'm like, my God, I think we're at a point where we're talking about the needs of the many and not the few. So City Council, who themselves were very trepidatious about this, have, as I understand it, approved it to become a permanent installation, which I think historical terms will be judged as a part of a movement to turn the Motor City back over to the people. Next slide. And one of the things that was great about that previous slide, and this is the temporary installation at Spirit Plaza, was the engagement and involvement of constituents and residents in participating in making these places. When you participate in making it, you certainly feel a right and a privilege to come and utilize and occupy those spaces and be proud of them and brag to out-of-town visitors about them as if they're your own, because that is in fact the intention. This entire median, we're looking from south to north, and the median was improved to include, well, it certainly has a terminus or origin of the Q line, 3.1 mile long rapid transit metro surface rail. But then it goes up further and it has this these red tables and chairs deployed in the median of a street. And maybe it was that the Detroiters had such a pent up hunger for ephemera in the urban environment that when tables and chairs were placed in the middle of a street median, that they grabbed their lunches from the newly opened Shake Shack and ran into the median to sit there and have lunch and just sort of revel in the fact that there are amenities that improve the quality of life for those who live and work in a place. Next slide. They also offer opportunities for bridging divides, and this is a great slide of an officer, Detroit Police Department, working with, playing with kids, this giant chess set. And that's typical of the kinds of activities that are invited by their programming. And we see in Campus Martius with everything from foosball tables to a sand beach, we see people utilizing those spaces that if you weren't from Detroit or weren't familiar with the Black community, you would have thought Black folks just don't participate in. There are lots of myths out there about what Black people do or don't do. And every single one of them is dispelled when you go to Detroit and you see this one brother skating around the ice rink in the winter, looking like he just stepped off the plane from the Olympics, and he's just doing his thing, just solitary. So bringing design sensitivity and design excellence to all communities, but with them and not for them, is kind of key to where we are right now. We're at a moment of reflection. We can think about how we move this stuff forward. Next slide. And this just is more showing the illustration of how streets in the center of downtown have been commandeered and given over to ephemera of one sort or another. Next slide. But I wanted to get to this because this is the Fitzgerald neighborhood, which sits in the northwest section of Detroit between University of Detroit Mercy College to the east and Marygrove College to the west. And the entire neighborhood between them was adopted as one of the city's neighborhood framework plan areas. And we believed that the key to a successful neighborhood starts with quality public infrastructure, and in this case, mainly a park. So the city invested in building this park, which, as it was under construction, residents, chattering among each other that they must be getting ready for gentrification. But in fact, because it was programmed, because it has a basketball court, because it has certain elements, because the invitation was very carefully done to neighbors, this is their park. This is the Ella Fitzgerald Park. This is their park. And the day it opened, the basketball courts were full and active. The tire swing had about 3 times more kids on it than they should have been allowed, but they were swinging around, and it was just a wonderful thing for people to feel like they've been seen and now are being provided with things that so many of us of privilege take for granted. So I'll leave it there.
Great. Are you able to stay with us for a little while, Stephen?
Yeah.
Or are you, okay.
I got a little slack.
Okay, cool. Great. Wow. It's just wonderful to be able to hear everybody's collective efforts from all different scales, from the city's effort to development to the work that we've been doing at LOHA across all these different platforms. And we've worked with, small scale developers and large scale developers. And I think it seems like you need to really approach it from all ends. You cannot, as Lauren Hood said yesterday, Lauren Hood said yesterday in our talk, you can't sit and wait for things to happen. You need to be the change for your community. You need to be the community that you want. You need to help initiate the community that you want for yourself. And so I think, a lot of the work that we're all doing is to take what we have and applying it. And so I just wanted to kind of touch on Lorcan. I don't know if you want to share some of our experience over the years in working on these smaller interventions with some private developers and doing parklets and other types of projects, and maybe talk a little bit about that and also, how the work has evolved. I know we kind of mentioned it, you did mention it in your presentation, but you want to maybe talk about our Formosa project and then maybe how we've got to where we are now. And
yes, I'm happy to. Just to just start the ball rolling here. I've always been fascinated with the challenge when you do private developments in cities. How do you avoid a hard edge between the private and public? And this idea of shared space or borrowing space from the private development for the public is a strategy we've had for a number of years, including an early project I did called Formosa 1140, where I was able to work with the city, work with the developer, and create a pocket park on private land, but it was for the public. And the dynamic of that was fascinating to be able to make that happen, meaning who's responsible. If the land is owned by people who live in the building, but it's ran by the city, who's responsible if something happens on that part in that park. So it kind of it piqued great interest in me. So the idea that we as architects amplify or at least take a strategy of amplified urbanism, meaning the work that we do extends beyond the boundaries of our property line, but we can engage sidewalk and streets. And that's why I'm fascinated by the images you use, Stephen, where I know I showed earlier in this presentation Jessica Stockholder's Color Jam, which is in Chicago, and it was painting, literally painting a major city intersection. But I love the images you showed where people felt empowered because the signifier that it provided to say, no, this is, you can engage, whether it's, so graphics are fascinating with how it can become more inclusive across boundaries, both socioeconomic levels, and not only programming, but just gestures like that are fascinating to me, whether it's an urban strategy on a crosswalk in the middle of an urban city, or it's providing pocket parks in a very dense urban area like Los Angeles. So we tried to do that with a number of projects, and certainly within our work in Detroit, we're working with Davos has been fantastic to look at. It's taken forever because we're having to be part of the fundraising to provide the resources for that. But anyway, just to start the ball rolling, I love that idea that as architects, we build ideas. And when you build ideas, who is coming? And that was an interesting comment that you mentioned, Stephen.
And I just want to encourage everybody, jump on in and let's make the discussion. Everybody can unmute themselves. So just dive in and make it dynamic and active. Yeah.
I'm seeing some interesting questions from one of our participants, Sean O'Neill, in the chat, who's asking about any plans or intentions from the city or from Bedrock to maybe rename streets or buildings or public places after some of the murdered Black folks whose names are being called in public demonstrations: Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, list goes on. It's when you say those names and you remain attached to those names, it's just painful to even talk about it. But so that their lives aren't lost in vain, our efforts here and so many others that are working right now are the things that will allow them to be change makers in their legacies that they've left for us to take on. And I think that that's a really honest and worthwhile question, one that possibly can't be answered by this group at this very moment, but one that should be carried back and pursued.
Yeah, and I would add to what Stephen is saying, and what John is probably thinking as well, working in the planning department, is that, as we who are working in the public realm, whether it's the city or development or architecture, working there within all of those, we are sort of dealing with past decisions, dealing with past names, dealing with past sculptures and cultural moments, public spaces created that are celebrating those cultural moments from decades ago, that marks a moment in history that was important 100 years ago, and becomes 100 years later. You see sort of reaction to that monumentalization of those moments in a way which seems as if we had never, how could we have even considered that as a culture? So it's dealing with public spaces decades ago. And so what I think Sean's really hitting on is like, what is this cultural moment here that we will be monumentalizing? I think I'm saying that word wrong. As we move forward, how are we going to be naming? What are the elements and sort of that we're going to be manifesting into public spaces and into the designs that we do going forward?
How do we commemorate and create places of memory? And honestly, 50 or 100 years from whenever we take these actions, there may be cause and reason to reevaluate and reassess. So we really need to think about, like there's a proposal afoot to create a pavilion on the mall in DC as a resting place for all these sculptures of the, dead presidents or generals who are being, snatched down, rightfully so. The symbols of oppression, if you're white and have not had a racial consciousness in your life, only observing it peripherally because it's affecting others who identify racially, then you're not affected by seeing symbols, seeing a pediment and a portico on a Georgian courthouse today that was being built in Anniston, Alabama, when in my foyer there's a photograph, a historical photograph of two Black people swinging from a tree being hung in front of a very same kind of building. So, you know, what are the messages that the architecture from a stylistic standpoint sends? And those are sort of carried around in our DNA now, and we have to purge those things. We can't forget, but we don't want to celebrate in a way that evokes pride. We want to celebrate in a way that evokes shame. And to your point, how could that ever have happened?
And I think, and just to chime in on that, you know, the picture that's on over my right shoulder, that is a picture of the Robert E. Lee statue in Richmond, Virginia, after what I would term as being improved upon with all kinds of delightful messages and well wishes, let's just say that. And as a person who grew up in Virginia, to be able to see that, to have that have dominion over me, to say that at one time it was the consensus of the population to say that, well, this is appropriate. And this is in no way commenting on the appropriateness of the question, but it's just reflecting on how times change, as Steve has alluded to. I think the thing to also consider from the city standpoint, this is something that we would need to engage the city of Detroit at large on from a public perspective, to see and what is it that we value? Is it about the individuals? Is it about the largesse of the movement in and of itself, of the issue at hand? Is it about naming Black Lives Matter Plaza somewhere in the city, or is it about a specific building or a specific person that has their name on it? And I think how we begin to speak of that monumentalism that Melissa referred to, how do we appropriate that in a way? I don't think it can be answered here, but I think it's worthy of a discussion.
There's so many great questions coming in, I just want to say right now, and I hope we can get to them. But I do want to also encourage people. I know there were some people raising their hands. We're going to go ahead and I forgot to say this at the beginning, have everybody drop their questions in the box, and then hopefully we can get to them. I just
not to clarify, just to clarify, the Q&A or the chat?
Well, they're kind of going into both. So let's throw them in the Q&A. How's that?
Sinead, there's one question in the chat I can certainly contribute to. From hopefully I say your first name right, Ray Sandana says, how does one convince private developers' developments to contribute to the public realm within their project extends and around them, considering not all clients would see value of losing square footage? I have to say that you take a position that you bring social agency to the project, or social equity. So if you're working and brainstorming with your client, you can actually bring and extend and carve in a way, borrow space from the private development if it brings value to the project. And in a sense, that also is inclusive. So in answering that question, you just have to see value in social equity in when you provide more public space and private property. And that's a way of bringing in light, bringing in quality of life, quality of space, and also engagement of the city when you create strategic moves and projects. And you, in a way, even Stephen, in one of your images, you show the extension of the public space in the private realm and your buildings, just by a very simple move, a very glass aspects that you can present and brainstorm with your client to push that idea that you can bring value, even if in a sense they feel like they're losing square footage, they're gaining square footage in terms of social agency or social equity. And that was just a jump out, just trying to respond to one of the
and Lorcan, if I could jump into, I mean, I think the way that we have been able to convince our companies in moving forward the importance of public space in all of our real estate projects is because the public space or the public realm can be reprogrammed and reactivated quickly and easily over time, whereas architecture and the permanency of architecture doesn't move at the same speed of that. And so what that means is that you can change up the public realm quickly and easily to appeal to different audiences, different markets, different times of day, different times of year, which brings a spontaneity to the architecture that architecture itself doesn't always enable that spontaneity to occur. And I think with that spontaneity, you also increase, to the point specifically, losing square footage, you're actually gaining square footage that result in revenue. So that's a very business answer to that question, but that is essentially what works.
Lorcan,
I've always said, Melissa, how on our Brush Park project, there was this moment in the growth of that project where we were looking to provide parking under each of our 4 buildings, and your team at Bedrock was absolutely committed to replacing, not bring parking in there, but actually make it more about a muse environment, something that's much more a paseo, more landscape central area that was for the public, as opposed to being access to underground parking through all these buildings. You were able to and open to relocate the parking to free up the central area of that whole development of City Modern, so it is more for the public. I would say that was a really fascinating commitment and a good strategy that you guys were interested in pushing. I think the space is better for that, and it's more of a public component, because ideally, if that ended up being access to driveways and parks or parking, it would not have the quality it does today. And that was a good move by you guys to actually remove the parking and make it.
Stephen has his hand up.
Are you leaving, Stephen?
I have to go, you guys. This is rich. I love it. And thanks to all the participants who joined and asked those questions, and all of my colleagues here. I miss you guys. We'll talk soon.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Stephen.
Bye, Stephen. Good luck.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was great. We can keep going. Yeah, there's definitely some great questions. It's Kevin Bridgman says, thank you for sharing these incredible projects. Could you describe the process of getting residents to participate in design workshops or physically building these installations that then grows into a feeling that is their space? So maybe talk a little bit about community engagement process. All 3 of you I think can really speak to that, because it comes from the bottom up, right? That's, you want to create spaces for the people as opposed to the opposite. John,
Well, I know with, for instance, with Grandmont Rosedale, there was a pop-up, usually the intervention of pop-ups in which you can invite community residents to participate in the actual process and to become a part of the actual fabric of building and understanding what's involved in those processes, how much effort it takes, the sweat equity, but realizing that once they finish, I being a resident, I'm a part of that. I help create that. In turn, that begins to instill a sense of pride, not only within themselves, but in their community. Within Detroit, we always tend to reach out to engage either in small groups and large groups. What we're trying to make even further efforts in is engage the youth, because a lot of times you could have the same crowd of people that could come to our community meetings and who could participate in some of these projects. But a lot of times the youth, they sort of get pushed aside a little bit. So we've been making more efforts in engaging the youth in the city in our public framework planning processes.
Yeah.
Just as a start. I don't know if anyone else would like to chime in on that as well.
Yeah, that's interesting that you said that about the youth, because yesterday Abir Ali, who was one of our speakers, was talking about that she works for the Ralph C. Oh my gosh, I'm forgetting the or
Wilson.
Ralph C. Willison Foundation. Thank you. And she's doing a lot of work with youth and after school programs and really asking them what they want and need, especially in these times of COVID when a lot of them are stuck indoors and don't have adequate outdoor spaces, and that they are kind of the unheard. People don't want to hear from young people. They're afraid of what they might say, but they're the people who probably have more insight into the future than perhaps we do sitting around this discussion. So they're really the
Well,
innovators.
it's interesting. Say, for instance, in the discussion of bike lanes, which could be a very welcome subject and a not so welcome subject, depending on who you engage with the city and where a bike lane happens to be. You know, for a kid, they see this, here's an opportunity for greater connectivity. I could go places, I could take my bike, I could ride safely. Making the effort to expand their realm, if you will. You know, in a city that has one of the worst rates of pedestrian vehicle accidents in the country. A lot of times that has some friction, depending on who you are, just simply because if someone doesn't ride a bike, they can't see the expenditure or the need to have the effort in constructing bike facilities. And a lot of times we run across that, and it's not, I'm not meaning to disparage that so much as it's part of the process of understanding where money is being spent. Is it being spent wisely? And to keep in mind that this is coming from a city that is emerging from bankruptcy. You know, just to be used to the commonality of having streetlights, for instance. You know, this is the place that Detroiters in this day and age are coming from. So there's that dichotomy of, or the juxtaposition rather of, you know, of all of the exciting things that are happening within the city, there's still some tremendous challenges that we do have in how we begin to apply resources across. And just the feedback we do get from our residents.
Lorcan, Melissa, do either of you want to touch on community engagement?
I mean, I can speak to the community engagement we had with City Modern, the project that Lorcan and I worked on, and John has also worked on over the past 5 years. City Modern as a project came at a very interesting moment where it was one of the first ground up project that had happened in the city, and the first ground up project that had happened in a historic district in the city in a long time. And so because it was a historic district and because we had decided that it was important to do contemporary architecture even in a historic district, we realized that there would need to be a lot of conversation about that in order to explain our intentions, in order to explain why contemporary architecture was going to be just as important and just as respectful of the historic architectural language within the Brush Park district, and then explain that to the community, to the city, to a lot of people, because it was also the first time a project was being built in a long time. And so we had over 60 community engagement meetings on that with various folks. And it was instrumental in getting to the project that we have today, which is a project that is and has been embraced by those that were already living within the neighborhood, and by those who are living around the neighborhood and watching it from other parts of the city. Community engagement and development is probably one of the most important things that can help shape urban design and public realm going forward. And so figuring that out and how to be comfortable with that conversation between developers and communities and professionals, design professionals, is probably the most important thing for us to figure out going forward.
Mhm.
I will jump in here. I totally agree. In the two neighborhood studies we did, both Northwest Detroit, which was a 7 square mile study we did, and also the Russell Woods Narden Park project that we were commissioned by the city of Detroit, we must have had 25 to 30 neighborhood meetings. And what's fascinating is that you see that input from the community as an asset, as opposed to something that's somewhat going to deviate or change what your challenges are, is not good. You have to really engage them and see what they have to say. And frankly, I think the projects make it better by having that feedback. And I was fascinated to go through that process, and in a sense took certain ideas and inspiration that we had in Detroit and applied that in here in Los Angeles, which is not necessarily a city that really embraces neighborhood meetings, community meetings. But Detroit was very successful in that. And I felt that all the meetings we had were incredibly productive, and ideas that came out of those neighborhood meetings were extremely important. And perhaps just to answer that question we have on chat room here is, they do feel it is for them, because we're able to manipulate, and that's, I think, our task as architects, as designers, is to bring our artistry perhaps to being able to take those words and those desires that they have and reformulate it into a way in the projects that it is for them, because they are ultimately the people who are going to be using these spaces. So why not design for them? It makes for better architecture. So you can do both. You can have social agency in your work, and you can bring architectural inventiveness, which I do think that City Modern has a combination of that as well. So that's what I'm fascinated by. Input from neighborhoods only makes the projects better. If you see that as a benefit to the projects, the more feedback you get from people who are going to be using it, the better. And Detroit certainly taught me that in a very big way.
We have another question. Oh, does anybody want to, sorry, jump in there? I didn't want to. We have a good question here from, and there's so many good ones. I'm like trying to pick and choose. From Troy Racinen. Sorry if I got the name wrong. I love to both Los Angeles and Detroit. How do you see some of the beautiful, inclusive design processes you have employed in these places, inspiring other leaders in places throughout North America and around the world? I think of the histories of these cities, what they with exporting the automobile and car-based city model, and wonder if it's possible to leapfrog some of the problems these cities have created with ways that we are now solving them. I don't know who wants to jump in on that one.
That's a big question.
It is a big question.
Yeah. I think what I liked best about all the images, or images that were embedded in all of the panelists' discussion today, was this idea of sort of spreading the cultural movement, cultural revolution into the streets and into the infrastructure. Infrastructure has always typically been so divisive on purpose. And it's a realm in which humans themselves haven't been able to occupy, except within some sort of vehicle or public transit. The idea that then you can, that humans can invade that space and take it back over is very poetic. And that's why it's feels so right for the moment of this past year, and of even the images, the past decade, the past multiple decades, because it is sort of humans reclaiming their right to public realm. And so where I think there's a lot of similarities between Detroit and LA is they, are both cities designed for the car first. And so the ways in which humans can then take over that space, we could share a lot of sort of design tactics for how to do that, ways in which you can share tactics for cultural movements into those infrastructures. And that's why I liked seeing those shared images across all of these car-centric cities, because it sort of embodies that movement, that human movement.
Right. I would say one other interesting experience for me, both working with the planning department in City of Detroit versus Los Angeles, is that in Detroit, they were very optimistic, very open over the last 5 years about ideas. And I have to say, Los Angeles can learn from that. It's a large bureaucracy, and when you deal with the city here in Los Angeles, it tends to be much more of a us versus them attitude. Whereas I think Detroit, and working with Maurice and Steve and everybody that I did work with there, was much more inclusive about how can we solve this? How can we make this better? But it was much more a kind of collaborative process, which I thought was fascinating and very different than Los Angeles. So there's lessons that Los Angeles can learn from how the city of Detroit and the planning department had an optimism about making things happen. And that's my experience the last number of years there. And being able to build not only Brush Park, but a number of our other projects we've done there. And that's what I learned from Detroit, and I miss when I'm working on projects here in Los Angeles. The other aspect about the nature of cities that are driven by or laid out in terms of top-down strategies with regards to cars, there is a way to rethink that and make cities more democratic with regards to pedestrian and bikes, and that's crucial. And I do believe that is being tackled in Detroit right now and Los Angeles. Parking is no longer required in a number of developments here in Santa Monica and other parts of Los Angeles. They're finally letting go. They're finally saying parking shouldn't drive your projects. There should be much more, a robust approach where there are people who are using public transit here in Los Angeles. There's other ways where people are moving, and mobility in the city is changing. So we need to design for that. And I do believe that attitude is starting to make a difference in the city, both LA and frankly in Detroit's approach in terms of taking those very wide bandwidth of roads and breaking it down and making it more democratic to people and bikes, among others. So I think there are some very interesting planning strategies that are going on in both cities that could be applied to others in North America.
And I think in addition to all of that, just with the advent of the onset of COVID, it has forced a lot of people to think about the realities of their own personal environment and how far they're wanting to go to get to certain services. So it may not require a car as much. And even in here in Detroit, we're having these discussions in as far as how we've turned some of our public rights of way into spaces that businesses could have so that they could have, say, occupancy, and I'm sure it's done elsewhere across the country, expand the occupancy capacity as much as they could just to be able to accommodate some semblance of business within your neighborhood without you necessarily having to travel outside of your normal realm of where you would need to go. But alongside that, working at home, I mean, all of us are sitting here for, some of us may be in an office and myself, I'm at home. Planning department may not be back in until sometime in the next calendar year. There's no date on that, but what it has done, it has forced people to think more about, where can I go to get good quality food? Where can I get my health care? Where can I get whatever service or whatever good that they may need? And the need to have that in close proximity, I think, is becoming more heightened, even within a car-centric city such as Detroit, that we're having to look at how we at least start with public realm spaces and how we can optimize that. But in addition, to think about to become more favorable in terms of what happens within that certain walkable radius of where you live and how that can be sustained.
And one of the questions I can kind of tag into what you just said is, how do we get these developers and to kind of keep up with these sentiments and see that value as well? Because that's really, especially, we need developers of all across a range of scales. And so how do we get the developers to buy into that? And do you see that people are seeing that this is the sentiment, that we're at a tipping point, that things are going to be different moving forward? Or do you feel people are kind of waiting for things to just go back to the way they were? Because personally, I believe that it's never going to go back the way, and I don't think it should, for that matter. You know, there's a lot of things that have already evolved in the past 6 months.
I think it's a little bit of both, because you're going to have habits that are going to develop. I mean, humans by nature are social creatures, but at the same time, you've exposed yourself to, say, the danger of a communicable disease. We may have more of these in the future, and the question is going to be, how do we begin to deal with it, and to be able to anticipate it? You know, as climate change happens, for instance, this is something that is worldwide. Climate change may expose us to more things, quite frankly, that either we haven't conceived of, or we didn't think that would happen as soon. So the ability for us as planners and designers to be able to accommodate that is going to be critical. And to be able to have that highly flexible and highly mobile as well is going to be critical. Just to be able to respond to the needs of the population. It's not going to be going back to the way it was, but I would imagine some may let their guard down a little, and it's perfectly understandable. But it's just keeping in mind that just to be prepared. But preparation isn't just about the health aspect of it, but it's just your general environment as well.
Well,
and how do we make those adjustments?
I think, John, your the planning department student has done an amazing job over the years. I've really enjoyed working in the city of Detroit over the years. And as you say, when this period's over, you know, how does one keep that, extend that attitude towards urban design and think about community and neighborhood? And so I think it's been, it's certainly, Los Angeles can learn a lot from Detroit in that way.
It definitely shifts the scale by which you're thinking, in terms of back to both John and Stephen talking about the 15-minute neighborhood or the 20-minute neighborhoods, and what is provided within that realm is now slightly different in the way that we should be thinking about designing that, and the public realm within that post-COVID. How much more autonomous does one want to be within that in preparation for something else that could happen, a second wave of anything, I don't know. And so it starts to sort of free up some of these nodes within the city a bit more, or potentially create new relationships between the nodes that weren't necessarily there before. And so if you think about it as that individual scale, and then also as they relate to one another, you know, you start to get to a different kind of city, and definitely a different kind of public realm that can promote equity, maybe even faster than in a traditional city model. And so I'm sort of excited about that. I think a lot of us right now are just sitting and sort of watching. Mm-hmm. But as we come out of this other side in the next, hopefully the next couple of months, and start to break free ideas towards the next phase, we're going to start to see some really innovative things come out, even if they're tests, that could potentially take cities in much different directions, or neighborhoods in much different directions. So it's both scary and exciting at the same time.
I think when you bring up equity, it's kind of sad and frustrating at the same time that it took a pandemic to, it didn't expose it, it was always exposed, but to have people to pay attention, let's say that. And the rate that COVID has affected minority populations in the country and how the country has dealt with it, it brings about a value question. And it's not just about the politics of it, but it also has to do with the planning and also the design of it. Because we all, to live and function and to participate, not only just in our city, in our state, country, whatever, but just in general, it's going to require a value shift that I think is happening, but it's still going to be a long struggle. Even if we could have a vaccine tomorrow that could cure everything, the underlying issues still remain in terms of how you have access to good health, how you have access to quality food, how you have access to clean water, what job do you have? I feel fortunate that I'm able to be here and to be able to work from home. And periodically I do go out into the community. We're sort of guarded by the extent that what we can do, just either by state mandate, as well as just personal safety. But at the same time, it's still, just for me as an African American, it's just extremely frustrating that it took this to say, okay, here's a problem. And I'm just hoping that we grasp this opportunity and we sort of rise from the ashes from it. If we don't, I don't know what else that could happen that would cause us to rethink that. But I'm cautiously optimistic that we can do this, or at least begin the Herculean effort to move it in the direction that we need to move it.
That's a perfect place to leave it. I think we're at the very last couple minutes, and I just want to thank you all for being in this conversation, and would love to keep the conversation going and hope we can participate in more of these types of things. But I agree that this is a very interesting moment. This is a moment that, again, the way I wanted to think about this panel is how can we see this as an opportunity? Now, there has been incredible loss, and we don't want to discount that in any way. But if we don't take this as an opportunity to make some kind of change, then humans are really stupid creatures, because this is just the moment. We couldn't have been hit over the head any harder by this thing. And it's I think there was a beer that said yesterday, get comfortable with the uncomfortable, because that's going to be like that for a long time. And as she also said, people of color have been uncomfortable for a long time, have been comfortable in the discomfort for a long time. So it opens up people's eyes to what other people have been experiencing in some ways. So it is a moment to, again, as you said, Melissa, the 2020 vision, we need to really have that clarity. So that's pretty symbolic in itself of the year that it happened. So without further ado, I just want to thank everybody again and appreciate you all joining us, and looking forward to more conversations to follow. And thank you again to Detroit Design Corps for allowing us to have this platform, and look forward to seeing you all soon.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.